His children laughed the day he inherited a broken-down fishing lodge on the edge of nowhere. They laughed even harder when they found out it came with 40 acres of swamp and a leaking roof. But they stopped laughing the morning his Belgian Malinois started clawing at the floor beneath the wood stove, and wouldn't stop until Hank got down on his knees to see why. Hank Boudreau had spent 31 years in the army. He had slept in places that had no name on any map. He had eaten cold rations in temperatures that cracked the skin on a man's hands, and still reported for duty the next morning without complaint. He had done all of it without asking for anything in return, and when he came home for the last time, his family had slowly, quietly, decided that he was someone to be managed. It didn't happen all at once. That was the thing about it. It crept in the way cold does, through the small gaps, the overlooked drafts, until one day you realize the whole house has gone freezing and you can't remember when it started. His son Nathan had suggested the basement suite first. Practical, he said. Close to the family, easier for everyone. What he meant was easier for Nathan, because the suite had its own entrance and Hank wouldn't have to walk through the main house at all. His daughter-in-law Priya made it clear, without ever saying it plainly, that the dog was not welcome on the upper floors. Nova, the Belgian Malinois Hank had worked with during his last deployment, a compact, amber-eyed dog who moved like water and thought like a soldier, stayed downstairs with him. They both did. Hank didn't complain. He had survived worse accommodations. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that lives in a house where people eat dinner 6 steps above your head and never come down to ask if you're hungry. He heard them talking sometimes through the ceiling. Not the words, just the tone, the tight, careful sound of people discussing a problem they didn't know how to solve. Nova always knew. She would lift her head from the floor, ears folded back, and press herself against Hank's leg without being asked. She had been trained to detect the earliest signs of a stress response. The change in breathing, the shift in muscle tension, the slight tremor in the hands that came before the memories arrived in full. She had saved him from the worst of it more times than he could count. She stayed close on the hard nights and gave him space on the easy ones, and he had never once had to explain himself to her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in February, when the snow outside was heavy and wet, and the kind that sticks to everything. Nathan brought it downstairs with the look of someone who had already decided it wasn't important. "Came for you," he said, and handed it over without pausing. The envelope was from a law office in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Hank read it twice at the kitchen table while Nova sat beside him, watching his face the way she always did when something was changing. The letter said he had inherited a property from a man named George Aldred, a fishing lodge on Rainy Lake, near Fort Francis, 42 acres of boreal forest, a main structure and 2 outbuildings. George Aldred had been Hank's uncle on his mother's side, a man he had met perhaps a dozen times over the course of his life. A quiet, self-contained person who had lived alone in northern Ontario since before Hank was born, and who had apparently, without any announcement, been watching Hank's life from a considerable distance. Hank set the letter down. Nova put her chin on his knee. When he showed the letter to Nathan that evening, his son's first question was not about George Aldred, or about the property, or about what Hank intended to do. His first question was whether the lodge could be sold. "It's pretty remote," Nathan said, scanning the letter quickly. "Probably needs work. But 40 acres up near the lake, there are hunting groups that pay good money for something like that. We could handle the listing, split the value, make sure you're set up somewhere comfortable." Hank looked at his son carefully. Somewhere comfortable was a phrase that had started appearing more often lately. It always arrived wearing a reasonable expression, but underneath it was the same suggestion, that Hank had become a problem to be repositioned. "I haven't decided anything yet," Hank said. Nathan put the letter on the table. "Dad, it's a fishing lodge in the middle of northern Ontario, in February. What exactly is there to decide?" Hank folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. Nova watched Nathan with her ears very still. The next morning, Hank packed a bag. It took him less than an hour. He had always traveled light. 2 changes of clothes, his army papers, a photograph of his unit taken somewhere in the Kandahar province in 2009, and the letter. He loaded Nova into the cab of his old GMC, and they drove north out of Sudbury before Nathan had finished his morning coffee. He didn't leave a note. He figured the truck being gone would say enough. The drive to Fort Frances took the better part of 2 days. The Trans-Canada stretched out in front of them, through stands of white birch and frozen lakes and long stretches of highway, where the only sign of human life was a gas station sign, appearing out of the tree line like a small miracle. Nova slept across the passenger seat, with her head on Hank's thigh for the first 3 hours, and then sat up and watched the road, the way she always did when they were getting close to something. They stopped for the night at a motel outside Wawa. Hank bought a sandwich from a gas station, split it with Nova, and slept better than he had in months. No sounds through the ceiling. No careful voices sighing what to do about him. Just wind-off Superior, and Nova breathing slowly at the foot of the bed. They reached Fort Frances the following afternoon. A local lawyer named Ted Pemberton met them at a coffee shop on Scott Street. He was a compact, gray-haired man who shook Hank's hand with both of his and looked down at Nova with genuine appreciation. "Fine animal," he said. "She knows it," Hank replied. Ted had the property documents spread across the table. The lodge was about 40 minutes east of town on a secondary road that turned to gravel after the first 10 kilometers. George Aldred had owned the property since 1974 and had kept it in reasonable shape, according to the maintenance records Ted had in the file. The roof had been replaced in 2019. The water pump was newer. The generator worked. Ted slid a key across the table. Old-style brass key, worn smooth. It reminded Hank of something his father used to keep on a nail by the back door. "Should be just as he left it," Ted said. They drove out to the property in the early evening. The secondary road ran through dense black spruce forest, the kind that absorbs sound and turns the light blue even in the afternoon. Hank drove slowly, watching for deer. Nova had her nose pressed to the edge of the window he'd left open 2 inches, reading the air. The lodge appeared around a bend in the road, set in a wide clearing that ran down to the frozen surface of the lake. It was built from squared pine logs that had darkened over the decades to the color of old honey. A covered porch ran the length of the front. A stone chimney rose from the east side of the building. Behind it, between the tree line and a frozen creek, 2 smaller outbuildings sat under caps of snow. Hank parked the truck and sat for a moment without moving. Nova made a soft sound in her throat. Not a warning, more like recognition. They got out. The air was sharp and clean in the way that northern Ontario air is in February, with that particular edge to it that reminds you the land has been here far longer than you have, and will be here long after. Hank stood in the clearing and listened. Nothing but wind and the creak of frozen branches. He used the key on the front door. It opened without hesitation, which he appreciated. Inside, the lodge smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and something faintly mineral. The cold stone smell of a building that had been sitting closed for a few weeks. The main room was large and low-ceilinged, with a wood stove against the north wall. A long table made from a single plank of birch and shelves covering most of the east wall, stacked with books, maps, and neatly labeled binders. Nova moved through the room systematically, the way she always did in a new space, checking corners, doorways, the area beneath the table, the space behind the wood stove. She completed her circuit and returned to Hank's side and sat down. Hank built a fire in the wood stove. The birch rounds from the box beside it caught quickly. He stood in the center of the room while the heat began to move, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the particular sensation of standing somewhere that belonged to him. He slept in the chair beside the stove that night. Nova took up her position near the front door. In the morning, he woke without dreaming. It was on the 3rd day that Nova found it. Hank had been working on the east outbuilding, replacing a hinge on the door that had rusted through when he heard her. Not barking, Nova rarely barked without reason. What he heard was the sound of her claws against wood, a rapid, insistent scraping that he recognized immediately. In the field, that sound had meant one thing. She had found something that needed to be found. He set down his tools and went inside. She was at the base of the wood stove, her nose pressed flat against the floorboards, her hindquarters up and her front paws working steadily at a gap between two boards that Hank wouldn't have noticed in 100 years of looking. "Easy," he said. "Easy now." She paused and looked at him, then looked back at the floor. He crouched beside her and pressed his knuckles against the boards she'd been targeting. The sound that came back was hollow. Not the dense knock of solid wood sitting on solid earth. Something underneath. He got a flat pry bar from his toolbox and worked the edge of one board up slowly, careful not to split it. The board came free with a low creak that filled the room. Beneath it, in the dim light from the window, he could see the top of a wooden staircase descending into the ground. He sat back on his heels. Nova stood beside him, looking down into the opening. Her tail moved once, slowly. "Well," Hank said quietly. "George." He found the lantern on the hook by the back door, where Ted had mentioned it would be, and he lit it and went down the stairs with Nova one step behind him. The staircase opened into a room that ran beneath most of the main lodge. The walls were poured concrete, dry and sealed, the kind of construction that someone had put real thought and real money into at some point. Wooden shelving covered 3 walls, floor to ceiling, packed with sealed plastic bins, metal document boxes, and what appeared on the far end to be a row of stainless steel cases the size of small suitcases. Hank walked to the nearest shelf and opened one of the document boxes. Inside were investment records, account statements, property purchase agreements spanning several decades. The numbers made him stop and read the page again, and then again. He set that box down and opened one of the stainless cases. Inside, stacked in rows behind foam padding, were gold coins. Not decorative coins, not collector pieces, bullion. Each one stamped with a maple leaf and a date. Hank stood in the underground room beneath his fishing lodge, on Rainy Lake in northern Ontario, and looked at what George Aldred had left him, and could not, for a full 30 seconds, produce a single coherent thought. Nova sat beside one of the lower shelves and watched him. On the small wooden desk in the far corner, set apart from everything else, as though it had been placed there deliberately, there was a leather notebook and a sealed envelope. The envelope had his name on it. Henry James Boudreau. Nobody had called him Henry in 40 years, but George had known his full name, apparently, and had used it. He carried the envelope to the chair at the desk and opened it by lamplight. The letter inside was written by hand, in the small, precise printing of someone who had spent a great deal of time being careful about words. It said, "Hank, if you're reading this, the dog found the room. I was counting on that. I have been watching your life from a distance for a long time. I know that might seem strange coming from a man you barely knew, but I watched carefully, and what I saw was a person who did what was asked of him without once asking for anything in return. I saw you serve. I saw you come home. I saw what came after, and I want you to know that I saw it clearly, even from this far away. 20 years ago, I attended a family gathering at your mother's house. You spent most of that afternoon helping a neighbor fix a collapsed section of fence in the rain, while everyone else sat inside arguing about things that didn't matter. You didn't know I was watching. But that was the afternoon I decided. I built this place to last. I built the room because I believe that real security is something a person earns, not something they inherit by accident or argument. You earned this, Hank. Every part of it. Use it the way you want. That's the only instruction I have, George." Hank held the letter for a long time. The lantern made a soft sound beside him. Nova came and put her head in his lap, and he rested his hand on her neck and stayed that way until the cold in the room began to find its way through his jacket. He brought only the letter upstairs with him that night. He replaced the floorboards carefully and moved the rug back over the spot. The lodge looked exactly as it had. He sat by the wood stove and read the letter once more, and then he folded it and put it in the same pocket where he'd been keeping the envelope from the law office. Outside, the lake was perfectly still under a sky full of stars. Northern Ontario in February. 42 acres of forest, a room beneath the floor with enough in it to change the rest of his life. Hank looked at Nova across the room. She wagged her tail once. He shook his head slowly. "I'll be damned," he said. 12 days later, Nathan's truck appeared at the end of the gravel road. Hank was on the porch, replacing a section of railing when he heard the engine. Nova was beside him. She raised her head before the truck came into view, and her posture changed in the subtle way it did when she recognized someone she didn't entirely trust. Nathan stepped out looking tired and irritated. His wife Priya came around from the passenger side, with her arms crossed against the cold, and her eyes moving over the lodge, with an expression that was trying to look neutral, and not quite managing it. "So this is it," Priya said. Nathan walked toward the porch. His breath came in short white clouds. "We didn't hear from you," he said. "We were concerned." Hank set down the hammer. "You knew where I was going." Nathan looked at the lodge, then back at Hank. "Dad, this place is in the middle of nowhere. It's February. You're living out here alone. I have Nova." Nathan glanced at the dog and looked away again. "That's not what I mean." Hank waited. Nathan pulled his gloves off and held them in both hands. "Look." He exhaled slowly. "We've been talking to a lawyer." Hank kept his face still. Nathan continued. "About the property. About how it's being managed. About your situation generally. My situation." Priya spoke then, in the measured tone she used when she was working up to something. "We're worried about you, Hank. You've been through a lot. The army, the PTSD, living alone out here with a dog in a cabin that's half frozen. It has excellent insulation," Hank said. "This isn't funny," Nathan said, his voice sharpening. Nova shifted half a step forward, not aggressive, just present. Hank looked at his son carefully. The same boy who had built model tanks on the basement floor. The same boy he had driven to hockey practice at 5 in the morning without complaint for 6 winters. Somewhere between then and now, something had shifted in him, and Hank suspected it had happened around the same time Nathan started making real money. "What exactly did the lawyer say?" Hank asked. Nathan glanced at Priya. "We want to make sure the estate is being handled properly. Given your age and your history, we think a formal review of your capacity to manage the inheritance might be." Hank raised one hand. He kept his voice level. "Say the word you mean." Nathan met his eyes. "Guardianship," he said. "We think it might be in your interest to have someone manage the assets on your behalf." Hank nodded once slowly. "And that someone would be you." Nathan started to answer. Hank shook his head. "You drove 6 hours to tell me you're taking me to court. We're trying to help you." Hank looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked out at the lake. The ice was starting to show the first faint gray patches. That meant it was thinking about spring. "You should head back before the road gets soft," he said. "It can go fast this time of year." Nathan's jaw tightened. "We'll see you at the hearing," he said. Hank watched them get back in the truck. He watched the truck disappear into the tree line. Nova pressed against his leg. He reached down and scratched behind her ear. "Well," he said quietly, "we've got work to do." He called Ted Pemberton that evening. From the landline George had kept connected. Ted listened without interrupting. When Hank finished, the lawyer was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know someone in Thunder Bay. She handles these cases. She's good. Her name was Irene Marsh, and she drove out to the lodge 2 days later in a truck, with a cracked windshield, and a thermos of coffee she shared with Hank at the birch plank table. While Nova slept near the wood stove, she reviewed the documents Ted had sent, asked Hank a series of precise questions about his medical history, his daily routine, his finances, and his understanding of the inherited property. And then she closed her folder and said, "The case they're building is thin. Your military records show PTSD treatment, but there is nothing in them that constitutes evidence of diminished capacity. You live independently, you manage your own finances, and you've made a clear and reasonable decision about the property." Hank nodded. "The dog will help," she added, with the calm matter-of-factness of someone who had done this before. A certified service animal, military background, visible bond with the owner. It matters to a judge. It shouldn't, but it does. Nova opened one eye from her spot by the stove. The hearing was held in Thunder Bay, on a Tuesday in late March, when the snow was finally softening at the edges, and the air smelled faintly, for the first time since November. Like something living, Hank drove down the morning of. Nova rode in the passenger seat. He wore the same sport jacket he'd worn to his discharge ceremony 30 years earlier, which still fit, which he took as a reasonable sign. The courtroom was smaller than he expected. Nathan sat at one table with a lawyer Hank hadn't seen before, a young man in an expensive suit who arranged his papers with the careful deliberateness of someone performing confidence. Irene sat beside Hank at the opposite table. She had brought a single folder and a pen. The proceedings took less time than Hank had anticipated. Nathan's lawyer presented the petition. He used words like isolation and vulnerability and complexity of estate management. He referenced Hank's PTSD diagnosis twice and his age 3 times. He was very polished. He sounded entirely reasonable. Irene spoke for 11 minutes. She laid out the facts. Hank's independent financial history, his management of his veteran's pension, his clear documented understanding of the property and its contents, and his decision-making record across the past 2 months since arriving in Fort Frances. She then noted, briefly, that the petitioning party stood to benefit substantially from a guardianship ruling, which, she said, was relevant context for the court. The judge asked Hank 2 questions directly. The first was whether he understood the nature of the estate he had inherited. Hank said he did. The second was whether he was receiving any support for his PTSD diagnosis. Hank said yes, he had a certified service animal and regular telehealth appointments with a Veterans Affairs counselor in Sudbury. Nova sat beside his chair the entire time. She didn't move, she didn't make a sound. The judge took 40 minutes. When he returned, he set his glasses on the bench and looked at the room, and said that on the evidence presented, there was no legal basis for a finding of diminished capacity. Petition denied. Nathan's lawyer was already closing his briefcase. Nathan stared at the surface of the table. He didn't look at Hank when the session was called to close, and Hank didn't wait for him to. Outside, the March sun was low and bright. Hank stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed the cold air coming off Superior. Nova sat beside him, squinting slightly in the light. Irene shook his hand at the bottom of the steps. "That's a good dog," she said. "She's the best partner I ever had," Hank said. Irene smiled. "I believe it," she said, and walked to her truck with the cracked windshield. Hank drove back north along the Trans-Canada, with the window down an inch. Nova, with her nose reading the forest air. The birches were still bare, but against the white of the snow, there was something in the light that was different from February. A particular quality that northern people recognize without being able to name it exactly. The feeling that the season has quietly made a decision. He got back to the lodge before dark, built a fire, cooked eggs on the cast iron pan George had left hanging above the stove, gave Nova a piece of toast, which she accepted with the dignity she brought to most things. He sat in the chair by the wood stove that night and thought about what George Aldred's letter had said. Use it the way you want. He thought about the men he had known who came back from deployments and found nothing waiting for them. No structure, no community, no quiet place to work through the noise in their heads. He thought about the fishing lodge, about the 42 acres, about the creek that ran behind the outbuildings, and the long, flat clearing between the tree line and the lake. He thought about it for several weeks. He made calls. He drove into Fort Frances and had long conversations with people at the Royal Canadian Legion branch on Scott Street. He talked to a Veterans Affairs regional coordinator. He talked to a contractor in Atikokan who specialized in accessible building. In the spring, when the ice on Rainy Lake broke up and the loons came back, a construction trailer appeared on the edge of the clearing. Over the next 2 years, the property changed. 4 small cabins went up along the western edge of the land, simple and solid, built for people who needed a place that was quiet and asked nothing of them. A woodworking shop went into one of the outbuildings. A dock went down to the water. A gravel path connected everything, so that people who needed it could get around easily. They called it the Aldred Lodge Veterans Retreat, and the name was Hank's quiet way of making sure that George's decision, all those years ago at a rainy family gathering, was not forgotten. Veterans started arriving that fall. Some came from Thunder Bay. Some came from much further. They came with the particular kind of wariness that a person develops when they have spent too long in places that didn't feel safe, and they loosened up slowly, the way you do when the environment finally starts to feel like it means what it says. Nova was always there. She moved through the retreat the way she had always moved. Quietly, attentively, with that particular Malinois awareness that makes people feel seen without feeling watched. Men who hadn't spoken more than a few words in months would find themselves sitting on the dock, talking to a dog who listened without agenda, and somehow that was enough to start. Hank greeted every person who arrived. He cooked breakfast on Saturdays in the main lodge. He fixed things that broke, which was often, because that was the kind of place it was. He didn't talk much about himself unless someone asked. Some of them knew about the court case. Word moves in veteran communities the way it always has, through networks of people who served together or knew someone who did. Nobody made a big deal of it. But once in a while, someone would look at Hank across the dinner table or out on the dock and say something quiet like, "Good thing you held on to the place." And Hank would nod and say, "Wasn't just me." He'd look at Nova, who would be lying in a patch of afternoon sun with her ears slightly back, doing what she had always done, keeping track of things, staying close, refusing to leave. The fortune George Aldred had buried beneath the floor of the old fishing lodge had made the retreat possible. Hank knew that, but there was something he had come to understand over those 2 years of building and talking and showing up every morning to a piece of land that was finally being used the way it was meant to be used. The money was just the beginning. The thing that mattered was what came after. Every man who sat on the dock and breathed in the lake air and felt, maybe for the first time in a long time, that the ground beneath him was solid and the people around him could be trusted. That was what George had been trying to say, Hank thought. Not just use the money wisely. Use the chance wisely. He was standing on the porch one evening in late September, watching the sun go down behind the spruce trees across the lake, when Nova pressed against his leg the way she sometimes did for no reason he could name. He reached down and put his hand on her head. The lake was perfectly still. The retreating light turned the water copper and then gray, and then the dark, honest blue of a northern evening. A loon called somewhere out in the middle of it, once, and then the forest was quiet. Hank had slept on cold floors. He had carried weight that didn't belong to him. He had come home from wars that most people had already stopped thinking about. And he had found, in the basement of a house that didn't want him, a way to keep going, because a dog had stayed beside him and refused to make him feel like a burden. And now he was here. He scratched Nova behind the ear. She leaned into his hand, the way she always had, the way he suspected she always would. "Good girl," he said quietly. The loon called again, further out this time, and the northern night came on soft and cold and full of stars.